So we're going to wrap up with 4 rapid-fire 15-minute presentations on a variety of topics, and it's really kind of interesting in areas, from educating non-technical people through, using ATT&CK, all the way to building an atomic testing program. First up is Ellie Searle from CrowdStrike. Ellie is head of content strategy there, returning to her security roots, where she was the senior technical writer for Secure Computing's Sidewinder Firewall. Ellie is passionate about creating experiences that make users' lives better, and she's done a little of everything, including technical support, technical writing, user research, interactive design, and UX writing. And her presentation is going to help us all understand how a broader audience can understand ATT&CK. Ellie.
Thank you. All right, as you just said, my name is Ellie Searle. I'm the lead content strategist on the user experience team at CrowdStrike. And if you're not familiar with CrowdStrike, we're an endpoint security vendor. And at the end of this attack, you'll have access to a worksheet with some of the conversational language that I'll be talking about, and another worksheet to work through if you want to come up with your own language. The focus of this talk is to help your non-security stakeholders understand ATT&CK. And I'll start with what we were doing before and why we decided to move to the ATT&CK model to describe our detections, and then the opportunities we saw to kind of evolve the model and make it easier for people to understand if they weren't already familiar with it. And I'll take you through what that model looks like and let you know what our customers think of it. So we used to use scenarios to describe our detections, which were really big buckets and didn't get very specific. And I'll show you what some of those are in a little bit. But we used to use, so we wound up getting a lot of customer calls because people didn't understand what the scenarios meant. It was just too vague. It was confusing. And one of the things we realized that if our Falcon admins didn't understand what those detections meant that they couldn't describe what the adversary was doing to anyone else in their organization, which made it a lot harder for them to get the funding and resourcing that they needed. So this is what they used to get. It was just kind of a long list of all the different scenarios. Some, helpful, drive-by download. Others, suspicious activity. A little more vague, a little less to go on. The icons were too hard to keep track of, and it was just, we weren't really setting the analysts up for success. So we switched to ATT&CK. Very exciting. Everyone's very happy with this decision. And so ATT&CK was just mapping everything to the tactic and technique. That was already better, but we realized it still needed some explanation. Without context, if you've never seen it before, you might not know exactly what a tactic means when you see it. For example, exfiltration, execution. If you're in the middle of figuring out if you've been breached, you might have to stop and think about it and not know exactly what the scope is. And what was really important for us was that anyone could understand what was happening regardless of their level of security experience coming to that. So we needed to be able to have them understand everything within the UI without having to do other research. And so a lot of my coworkers said that, oh, you're going to dumb it down. And I'd really like to caution people on even having that mentality, because people in your organization can understand this. They just need more context. This isn't about dumbing it down for them. And so what I encourage people to think about is sort of a master-apprentice relationship when you're going to explain these things to people. They're capable of learning it. They just need a scaffold. They just need a way to, by the time you get to the technique, they understand what the significance of it is, like what is happening. And the best way I know to do that is with clear conversational language. Should be like a human is talking to you instead of you're interacting with a digital experience. So the tactic names they're good, they're really helpful, but they don't flow off, they don't roll off the tongue. It's not something that you can just put into a sentence like an adversary is trying to initial access. People don't grasp it quite as quickly. So played around with, came up with a couple other phrases that could be used instead. For example, an adversary is trying to get into your environment, get into your network, depending on what your language you use. Another one, an adversary is trying to run malicious code. This gives a much higher sense of urgency and makes it much clearer to people what exactly is happening as opposed to just saying execution. Another one, an adversary is trying to maintain their foothold. You want to make it clear as quickly as possible, they're there, they're working to stay put. So I did this with all of the tactics. And it was conversational, it was good, we liked the direction it was going, but it's a lot of words to put into a UI. And so that was the end goal again, so that in their workflow, they didn't have to go anywhere, they could understand it. So I did another round and challenged myself, how few words can I use to convey this? And this is what I came up with. So at one point, I even got down to one word, explore. But the rest of them, 2 words, but still, it fit in, it would fit into a UI much, much better. And give the highest level context of the adversary is trying to gain access or gain more access. The adversary is trying to keep their access. I want to say the adversary is just trying to steal and break things, but I was told that follow through is perhaps a bit more professional, so that's the direction we went. But these are the moments where they're really doing what they came to do, is one of the ways to communicate to other people. And then for people who are familiar with playing with navigators, we've seen this is pretty similar to layers, like when you name a layer. And so we realized we could start to group these concepts. And this also, instead of like the 21 icons I had before, now we could get it down to 5 icons if we needed shorthand within the UI to give some sort of sense of like, hey, this is what's going on in this area with this detection. So one of the things that I want is to give people sort of a Mad Libs, really that you can phrase, that you can describe this to anybody. So the adversary is trying to objective by tactic using technique. So for example, the adversary is trying to gain access by stealing logins and passwords using credential dumping. So you can still keep that key technique in the explanation, but people have a sense of what's going on by the time you get to it. Another one, the adversary is trying to keep access by avoiding detection using process hollowing. And this will stand up for all of the techniques in the matrix. So it's an interesting idea. I thought that it had a lot of promise, but I needed to figure out, and I needed to test it and see how well it stood up. So the first thing I did was go to my internal experts and make sure it didn't get in their way. I went to our threat hunting team and said, if I include these words, can you A, map them really quickly back to what they're supposed to be, and can we put it in a way that doesn't get in your way? And one of the things we had played around with was actually using the more conversational labels instead of the tactic to go after that goal of someone can understand it regardless of their experience in the UI. But we realized that we lose the standardization. It really is important that people who do know it can still know exactly what tactic it is and get people to learn the conversational language maps to this tactic name. So we left the tactic names the same in the UI, but in our documentation is where we use the more conversational language. And then this was part of actually a much bigger user experience approach to improving how we present our detections to all of our customers. So I was partnered with our user experience designers to figure out how we can present this information in the UI with a good information hierarchy. And we had our researchers who were talking to customers before with the detection framework that we had with all the scenarios, and then beta tested it and then talked to them afterwards to find out, was it valuable to you? Is there any more changes that we can make? So here's what we came up with in terms of what customers now see in the UI, what our analysts see in the UI. So as I mentioned, you can still get to the technique, which is the key information, but there's the framework of the gaining access, so that you immediately get all of the context when you see this. And then also in here is the description, which we've also worked on improving how well we explain that and set the researchers up and analysts up to start their investigation. And then in the docs, as I mentioned, this is where we provide that more conversational language. You can actually link to it from within the interface, the UI itself. Again, just 5 icons, which is much better to keep track of. And I know people sometimes are like, nobody reads the docs, but if this is your job and you've never seen it before, there's a chance you're going to go and look it up. So we want to make sure that they had easy access to that. So the question is, now we've got this into the UI and we've got documentation that's much more conversational. How successful was this? How much better did our customers think this was compared to what we were giving them before? And it worked really, really well. A lot of this has to do with the fact that just the matrix in and of itself is super useful to be able to map that tactic and technique combination. But the fact we added the additional context and put it in the UI meant that they could pick it up really, really quickly. So here are just some of the things that we heard. If you can't explain something, you don't know what it is. I feel with these new details, I can tell them XYZ happened, please check on this exact thing. Another one, we find it useful for younger analysts as well. The fact that we are saving them training time, they see as a huge benefit. And also, they can take that screenshot that I showed you before and show it to pretty much anyone in their org, and they can understand quickly why it's important and what's going on. And then our sales engineers and our support staff also are really happy with this change and are getting lots of positive feedback from our customers. So one of the things I said is, they aren't a very technical crowd, so it's like learning that there's this whole new language that's way easier to understand and act on. And I think we all know that it's great when you're dealing with a really smart user base that understands everything, is super familiar with it, but we need security to be approachable to the entire market. So that's one of the reasons we were embracing this approach. I hope that you try this at home. Like I said, I have included the worksheet that's got the conversational language that we came up with, if that works for you. Or you can also play around with that cheat sheet and come up with language that on your own. Thank you. If people have questions, I'm happy to answer.
So we do have a couple minutes for questions. Does anyone have questions for Ellie? Yep, I'll bang in the back there.
Thanks. Can you give me a sense of how long this whole process took? You know, kind of like calendar months? Is this like years or months or weeks, or how'd it go?
Which part of it? The remapping the language I did like one afternoon, and all of a sudden everyone's like, oh, that could be useful. In terms of the effort of mapping everything and designing it, there'd been some talk and planning about it, but start to finish, we kicked it off in January of this year, and then had a really nice long beta period and actually had time to iterate and code based on beta feedback, and have been rolling it out. So it's now, I think tomorrow is the day it is officially everywhere within the product. So yeah. And if anybody wants to see, kind of compare and contrast, we've got a booth out there where you can see what the old detection experience was in a video, because it's so new we haven't updated everything. But you can also then kind of go through and see what it looks like in the flow with the actual code. So just again, not to promote the product, but just to see how the descriptions changed and improved, and how adding that more context just makes people understand things a lot faster.
Do we have another question?
In the back.
Oh, over in the back.
So I'm curious, you've used ATT&CK to map descriptions. Is there an initiative to use it to map weighting for severity on countermeasure detections, whether or not it's a high or medium or low, or is it just purely for consumption by non-technical people, just for meaning's sake?
At this point, we're sort of in our V1, and it definitely was just mapping the detections to the tactic and technique combination. So we'll see where it goes in the future, but that's where we are right now.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Oh, we have one over there.
Of course. Going long.
Getting your work.
I might take somebody out.
So that sentence that you had, the Mad Libs, I think that's what you called it. I don't know if it's Mad Libs as much as it is more of like a drop-down options, I guess.
Probably.
So you have, it was the adversary is trying to, you have an objective which maps to your table that you had by tactic, which doesn't map to anything that I could see.
Well, the tactic is the MITRE tactics.
Well, so by using technique, so the technique then shows up in the attack matrix again. So the question is, with the tactics, do you have those enumerated somewhere, or is there, in other words, is there a drop-down list that we can pick from, or is it something that
It's initial access, it's execution, it's the ones that are sort of the tactics that are on the MITRE wiki that you'll find. Might not.
They weren't there,
understanding it right.
yeah. Well, so you're saying all the, all
The tactic names, okay, I think I see what you're saying. So the tactics is what I listed in the left-hand side, and those are the names that MITRE that I put into the attack matrix. I did do a pass on them to make that language more conversational. So I think that's what you're asking.
Yes.
So that's the second column in there is when I did a pass on to be like, if I were just to explain it to somebody, how would I explain execution using a conversational phrase? And so that list I do include in the cheat sheet.
okay, so the conversational phrase is what's missing right now, and you have
Yes,
that.
sorry,
too.
yeah, exactly. So it is still the tactic, but it's the conversational
Yep.
way of explaining the tactic, which is that sort of the get into your network, the maintain your foothold.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's for that reason we didn't want to putting that conversational language into the UI because we think that keeping that tactic name for consistency and standardization was really important, but so you have to just use that when you're explaining it. It helps to have that mapping to the more conversational language.
Thanks.
All right, let's thank Ellie.